Well, we're going to go ahead and get started. And maybe I know that our technical assistant will be back to help Kirt with his computer, hopefully. Welcome to our session on universities and slavery, universities and segregation. I'm Leslie Harris, professor of history at Northwestern University, formerly associate professor of history and African American studies at Emory, where I did a lot of work on slavery in universities, or I should say facilitated a lot of work is how I think about it. Several of our other panelists were not able to be with us today, unfortunately, but we are going to have a good conversation, and we are looking forward to hearing your responses to the issues raised by this work. I'll just say briefly that I wrote an essay for the American Association of Universities, University Professors, that did an overview of 20 years roughly of doing this work. I think we could fudge a little bit with the dates. Yale in the late 90s had an initial foray into this area by graduate students. But one of the ongoing questions is the meaning of this work beyond simply the production of scholarship. Many of you already know that there have been now numerous books, articles, websites about the work produced. This is what we do in the Academy. There have also been pushes to rename buildings, to take down statues, which have met with greater and lesser degrees of resistance. But I think there's a broader question about equity in higher education that was the case for many of the people who started the work. And frankly, how do we use the work to center questions of equity? And so those questions are raised not only in terms of diversity and equity on campuses, but also even equity in terms of who is in charge of doing the work, how that work translates into careers, the meaning of equity in all kinds of ways. And then, of course, what is the meaning of equity in higher education in our larger society? So I'm hoping that we can get to all of those questions, both via the work and life experiences of our panelists, and then in terms of questions from you all. I'm going to briefly introduce our panelists, and then we have a series of questions that we will ask and answer together. And then at any time, I will try to keep an eye on the chat. Feel free to type your question into the chat. And I will try to bring that question in as it's relevant to the conversation as well. So if we're in the middle of an answer and you have an idea about what we're saying that you want us to bring into the conversation, please use the chat to do that. Okay, Hilary Green is Associate Professor of History in the Department of Race and Gender Studies at the University of Alabama. She earned a BA in History with minors in Africana Studies and Pre-Healing Arts from Franklin and Marshall College, and a PhD in History from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Her research and teaching interests include the intersections of race, class, and gender in African American history, the American Civil War, Reconstruction, Civil War memory, the U.S. South, 19th century America, and the Atlantic world. Her first book, titled Educational Reconstruction, African American Schools in the Urban South, 1865 to 1890, came out in 2016 with the Fordham University Press and explores the development of African American public schools in Richmond, Virginia, and Mobile, Alabama. She is currently at work on her second book, Unforgettable Sacrifice, which focuses on how African Americans remembered and commemorated the American Civil War and its legacy. In January 2015, she developed the Hallowed Grounds Project, which explores the history of race, slavery, and memory at the University of Alabama and the post-emancipation developments in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, where the university is situated. This ongoing scholarly project seeks to make accessible visualizations, transcriptions, primary sources, and other materials for understanding the history of slavery at the University of Alabama and its legacy. It is designed for current students, alumni, faculty, staff, and descendants who want to deepen their understanding of this underappreciated campus history through campus tours, academic courses, and a sustainable digital humanities presence. Kirt von Daacke is professor of history and assistant dean at the University of Virginia. His first book, Freedom Has a Face, Race, Identity, and Community in Jefferson's Virginia, was published in 2012. He is also a graduate of the University of Virginia, and so he is bringing his own personal experience back to the university. He was contributing author for a new edited volume on slavery at the University of Virginia, Educated in Tyranny, in 2019, and I had the opportunity to read that book. It's an amazing resource. He's currently editing a volume on UVA's post-1865 history called After Emancipation, a history of race, community, a history of race and community, and the University of Virginia. And that book is currently under review with the University of Virginia Press. He has co-chaired and led the research project, I think it was a 5-year project, for UVA's President's Commission on Slavery in the University, which published its report in 2018. And the book, the first book, Educated in Tyranny, comes out of that process in part. And UVA then turned to a second 5-year project, of which he is currently co-chair, the President's Commission on the University in the Age of Segregation. The President's Commission on Slavery in the University culminated in the completion of a significant memorial to enslaved laborers that was completed in 2020 and then dedicated in spring 2021. I still have to get to Charlottesville to see it. The pictures on the web are just fantastic. I will also mention that UVA is still, I believe, the home of the organization University Studying Slavery, which is a national organization that invites institutions to join and to be a part of common conversations, usually conferences and other ways to collaborate on these issues. And again, the second President's Commission on the University in the Age of Segregation at UVA investigates UVA's past from 1865 to 1965. So welcome to both Hilary and Kirt. Kirt, are you able to speak? No. Okay. We do have a tech organizer. It says any microphone option is unavailable. We will do what we can in the meantime. Maybe you can type, I'm not sure. My first question for both of our panelists is how they became involved in university studying slavery and segregation, and how that relates to their research, teaching, and career trajectory as they imagined it at the start of their careers. And I can also add my own experience in as well. So Hilary, why don't you start us off?
Yes, thank you so much for having this panel, and thank you for those in the audience. So I stumbled into my research because of intellectual curiosity and a student comment in the form of a question made in January 2015. This is my second semester at the University of Alabama. My own work focuses more on Reconstruction and the afterlives of slavery by those who survived the institution and by those who wanted them to collectively dismantle freedom's gains and promote whitewashed narratives for political reasons. Campus history was never part of my intended research, teaching, and career trajectory, but it has become one, and it's become a significant one. I have now, because of that comment and intellectual curiosity, I have incorporated all this history in all of my classes through assignments, developed 2 courses on it, undergrad level and a grad course I'm going to be teaching in the spring. Develop resources by walking the campus. I've walked the campus now with over 5,000 individuals in the Alabama heat, most commonly, to talk about this history. I have done collaborations with digitizing content, making those transcriptions available by listening to African-American homeschool parents who wanted to take their sons and daughters out of the schools because of how race was taught, and the classroom to prison pipeline that was being developed. I've also worked with the UA Special Collections in getting more materials digitized. So now the faculty minutes and other materials are now accessible for scholars digitally. For research, I was working on my first book when I started this project and wrapping that up. And I have now published and have several forthcoming articles on history, methods, but more importantly, autoethnographical approach, because I can't divorce myself from the process and the history. And communities respond to that well. They want to know what my process is. And hopefully, because of that, once my second book is done, I am committed to make this my third book project. I will be looking at the lives of the enslaved people, but more importantly, the institutions that they built after the Civil War, during the Jim Crow era and Reconstruction, and then the end with the competing Black memories and institutional memories that oftentimes clash and sometimes come together. And what does that mean? That there's two different knowledges of what slavery looked like, the lives on the enslaved, the impacts on Tuscaloosa and the campus community. So for me, it has become my research. And that's my advice to you. No matter how you got into it, all of us have stumbled in this. We never intentionally did it. But once you become committed, make it work for you. Teach. That's what we do best. We publish, but also we engage various communities. Make sure you do all that and it works for you, no matter how you got there.
Thanks, Hilary. Could you expand on what you used the term autoethnographic research, which I don't think historians typically use that term. So could you say more about that and how you got to that part of the work?
Yeah, this is where being in the interdisciplinary department matters. So I'm in gender and race studies and 1/4 American studies. And sometimes autoethnographical work is called me research, communication studies, where you embrace that first person. You embrace your positionality and how you bring it in. It's not memoir, it's not that, but you as the scholar is a part of the narrative as well. And so for me, that was very helpful to do because a lot of people were scared. A lot of people were like, well, why does this matter? How you're a historian, you do history. Not that I don't like researching slavery. And I tell that to people all the time. And they laugh at me. But by telling how I got to this project, why I'm committed, the people who I'm involved with, and making sure they know it's me connected to this long history, I've been able to show the connection of Black women's labor from slavery to the present, talk about the questions of equity, the lack of resources, and what does this mean by making sure that I'm a part of this. And I also look to my other people who are doing this work, and I think that's the most gripping, most powerful, and how it changes the conversations, that we're not this cold, static scholar anymore. We're in the process as well.
I just dropped into the chat a book that I think, hearing your description of that, describes this process well. Rhonda Robinson Thomas's book called My Name Clemson, in which she weaves in her personal experience of doing the research, the things that she experienced, her feelings about it really, with the history of Clemson that she uncovers, which is partly in slavery, but also very much part of the post-emancipation era. And I recommend that to anyone who is thinking about the work in those multidimensional ways. And I think you're right that what you've said is, for many of us, we backed into the work landed on the doorstep, and we took part in it, sometimes with conflicted feelings. I'll say that my own entry into the work came through some racial incidents that were happening at Emory, and a realization that my faculty colleagues, for the most part, and I had very different understandings of the institution that we were part of. And there were hidden histories of race. I wouldn't say that I, as a Black woman, depending on when you enter the institution, you don't know all the background. And different generations had different understandings of diversity and equity issues. Of course, people from different backgrounds had different understanding. And then when we stepped into the staff space, their understanding of the university was very different. And so we became more and more curious about how to bring those different threads together to, I would say, more inform the way we move through the institution. So rather than simply saying everything's all right for me, not sure what you're talking about, we wanted to encourage greater curiosity about the many facets of the university. Emory has a well-known medical school and a hospital and public health and all of these things that make a difference not only for those who are employed at the institution, but for its standing in Atlanta and how it engages with multiple communities. And this idea that the university should be more conscious of the histories, stories, experiences of it that circulate within different groups within the institution and groups outside the institution. And so, like Hilary, I stumbled into the work. It's been fascinating. I'll also say I chose not to have my own publication on the work. I didn't want to do a single authored book. I was very clear about that. So just to provide a sort of counterpoint, I have had and have many other things that I want to write about. Slavery in universities was not one of them. And so I'll just say honestly that that did create a bit of a tension for me as someone who was fostering other people's research out here and building on and creating what we call the Transforming Community Project. Many of you may know Mark Auslander's incredible work, his incredible research. And I was very happy to have him do that work and publish the book that he published. It's a wonderful book. He also did much more teaching before he left Emory, using this as an opportunity to introduce students to a kind of activist scholarship, deep research, working with communities to recover their histories. And also, you know, one of the most sensitive and best things he did was work with students to recover the historic graveyard. The right part of the graveyard at Emory, at Oxford College, was perfect, the Black graveyard. I won't go into all of the ins and outs of it, but it was in disrepair. And his students worked with the community to repair that graveyard as much as they could and recover it. So, but for me, that was not my, that part of the work was not as interesting to me. It was not of interest to me as something that would be central. And so I think, Hilary, you may have been at a panel years ago. You asked at that time, and I never forget, you asked at that time, well, you know, how do you bring these together? And you were an assistant professor, and I was very worried, as I always am, about tenure. And I said, if you're going to do it, if you can get a research project, a publication out of it, that's great. But do not let it distract you from what you need to do to get tenure. And I think that's still a challenge sometimes for people doing the work, even sometimes beyond tenure. How do you balance this work? I'll say too that at the time, I don't know if this has changed now because of the work, but to do historical research on education topics, on university topics, on the university you attend has been not valued. So this, I guess I'll ask it as a question to Hilary and to Kirt. I hope Kirt will be able to join us soon.
I think he's typing in his comments.
Oh, okay, I haven't gone down. How much, oh great, how much the this work is being valued because of the depth of research that you, Hilary, and Kirt and people there. So I'm looking at Kirt's comments, and I hope everyone can read it. That he also, so we are the stumblers. The people who it landed at our doorstep, at our feet, and we decided to pick it up and run with it. And I'll just say, Kirt is also saying create a curriculum, made changes to the built landscape, so the history was visible. No good deed goes unpunished. This is something I think many of us said over the years. And Kirt is now officially a historian working in public. And you see the scholarship here as more than peer-reviewed work. Let's talk about that for a minute. And Kirt, if you want to continue typing about that, 8+ years of full-time service work to the university. So how are you integrating? I'll say that many people called my work service, partly because I didn't publish in it, but I think also I did, you know, co-edit the edited volume. I guess my question is, the both of you have published more directly in this field. And so how do we respond to this question of service work scholarship, the other thing that Kirt's bringing up, that both of you bring up, engagement with the public, right? Engagement with your communities. Both of you are in college towns in a sense. So how are you thinking about, looking back on your own experience, how would you bring together service, which community work is often seen as service unless you're in that kind of, sociological field or medical field where you get a grant and you do a study. And this is not quite that in the same way.
Honestly, it wasn't respected. I was going to be flat. I'll be honest. I'm grateful that I'm in gender and race studies. I'm grateful for my chair, Utes McKnight, who helped with Al Brophy in getting the apology and the marker. And the first thing I said, I'm like, because I was on tenure, I'm like, are you okay with me doing this?
Yes.
Outside of my department, it wasn't legible. I was seen as the person who gave tours. Not that this was a historical project, public service, and the like. Publishing became a way that made me legible. That wasn't just something that was there, but also too, it wasn't just for legibility and promotion and raises, which thank goodness we get. The community asked me for it. And Black homeschool parents of Tuscaloosa County, some of the progressive parents, those who took the tour kept on asking, well, where can we read this? I want my son to be able to teach this. Nothing like seeing an 8-year-old child who's going with their mother on the tour with their phone, and then having that young child email you asking for more information. And it was the move for publication vis-a-vis not just the institutional pressure, but the community asking for this, that moved me into that direction. And then I figured out by publishing, it helps the university bring me along. And I like how Kirt said that you're a historian working in the public. And that's how I transformed it. But I made it comfortable for me in response to the Black community who was asking it, rather than the university saying publish, publish, publish. So it was that balance that had to be there. But by publishing, teaching, guest lecturing outside of the institution, other people started to look at my work as not just a service, but actually as a scholar doing public work. And that is something that I think all of us have to deal with. We look at it as service, but institutions don't know how to read it. How do we make that stuff legible while taking care of our individual selves in our lives? But we became historians working in the larger public, and we had to build that reputation to do it. And
Kirt adds, outside my department, my work was illegible. Love that phrase. The really difficult work here of the research, teaching, and community engagement. And I think what Kirt's referring to is that, and you both are, when you're doing this work in public, you have different pressures from the community. And I know a little bit about the Charlottesville, Kirt's work with UVA Charlottesville, and how, of course, there's such a conflicted, long, difficult relationship, particularly between the Black community and UVA for all the right reasons. Totally understandable, but how that affects how the research happens, that it takes time to build these relationships. That you can't just, or you don't want to, ethically, just walk into a community, pull up all the information, and just, turn it into the next line on your CV for promotion. That I think the work calls to a greater ethical responsibility. I'm really taken too, Hilary, by this idea that this third book was asked for by the community. I'll say that Darlene Clark Hine often talks about the fact that when she was in the Midwest, part of her turn to Black women's history in a particular way was because Black women asked her and pursued her. And that's when she came into this, incredible career of making sure that Black women's histories were preserved. So there is this intense connection between our communities, local, national, sometimes international, and our our felt sense of responsibility. Kirt is writing, the end result of all that hard work by me and others is often only understood as the memorial, but the memorial is a foundation for ongoing self-examination and building a better relationship with the community we are embedded in. Thanks, because that's actually where part of where I want to go next is a lot of institutions have had a lot of conflict and discussion and work around what has been memorialized and what is to be memorialized now. And I'll say that at Emory, this was work that began probably even before I arrived, but before slavery and university studies, before that was a thing, that there was a committee that was looking at ways to memorialize a more diverse group of people who had been part of the university. And this is in the late 90s, I got an email asking my opinion about some of this. So I'll say that institutions, in fact, do this. It is not unusual. You know, I think many of us who are here probably know that, but I just want to reinforce that the reconsideration of names on buildings or on who should go on new buildings, this is a constant. It is not simply driven by PC issues, although that's the way it's been presented. In the general public, it's driven by, as universities learn, and by that I mean the people within them, they have new focus or a new thing they want to emphasize. This is what happens. Of course, many of the renaming and memorialization efforts we've seen recently have come from protests, and so it should be, from activism. People within and outside the institution asking, who really are you and what are you trying to say? So I'll say that Kirt's comment for me is so meaningful about how it's the foundation for ongoing self-examination. And so I guess I'll ask the question, which is a little bit about the process of these memorials for each of you and what they mean. I think Alabama has some memorials that are more, if I remember correctly, more 20th century focus, civil rights era focus, but other ways of rememorializing or reframing some of the older symbols there. So
I was going to say, one of the things that this is, another way is how my work has changed the campus and what keeps me going. By walking the campus with all those 5,000, over 5,000, like 5,100 odd people, I witnessed campus conversations change, where it wasn't just like, okay, who's the biggest donor who can rename this building, to what are our values in these building names. And one of the things I think about is the facilitative ongoing conversations about this that has led to some meaningful changes. So one is the formal creation of a group that's actually looking at all of our memorials and what do we do. But more importantly, the post-George Floyd reckoning at UA, that wasn't protests. We had 2 petitions and a working group that came out of our trustees. But I witnessed when from June 8th and 9th, 2020, the Confederate monument removed from our campus, put on the flatbed and put into storage. 2 plaques removed from campus. We've had several buildings renamed with namesakes connected to slavery, the Confederacy, and segregationists. And we have a creation right now of a postdoc position, which I'm on the committee for. That is, it closes December 1st, so please apply. I love to read your materials, but it's not just monuments, but the people and the institutional structures that change. But that was a 5-year process to get us there. Yep. And as I always say, we can remove a monument, we can add a monument, but the hard work begins after you put up or remove something. The work continues, and this is where it goes back to people, institutional will. And monuments and memorials are great. And I will say to Kirt, I can't wait to see that monument when I go down to Charlottesville. And for me, just to see those names etched on granite and that symbol, that's what we need. But that's the start. Right. And you're correct, we need more, but we need to remove those problematic symbols of the Confederacy, segregation. I talk to community members who do not feel comfortable walking on the campus when that boulder was there, even for tailgate. it reminded them of what Coretta Mitchell talks about, know your place aggression.
Right.
You saw that, you knew your place. We need to remove those symbols if we want to go further. So I see it as facilitating conversations, but I've been grateful by walking the campus and physically using the campus, people have changed. And that's something that if anything that I saw is better than any monument could ever be, because I just produced a whole bunch of living monuments who are now telling the fuller story that something in stone could not.
Kirt has added on this point, creating a sense of campus-wide interpretation also. So it's not just the one place or the one monument or the one sign, but that this needs to be woven in across the campus. Renovated, interpreted 2 burial grounds. I was at that first so moving ceremony. Naming 2 new buildings, creating a walking tour map and app, the memorial. So much more work to do, of course. There are 2 questions that I want to turn to. One is about archives. What efforts can be made to make sure that archival silences aren't being perpetuated by work that is currently being done? If the descendants of the enslaved who are tied to these entities or the people who suffer the harm of segregation are not engaged and versus preserved, the silencing continues. And then a question about the work of making this research visible is taking place at R1 and other elite institutions. Why is the work less common, or is it just less visible in places with more blurred lines between scholarship, research, and teaching? So first, archives, and maybe you can discuss also your work with archivists, because I'm convinced that rarely do well, I don't want to say rarely. Archives don't always destroy material, but they do decide who they will allow to see material. And I've definitely had that experience of feeling that there's stuff there that I'm not being shown. Not in terms of this work, but in terms of my other work. And there's certainly been historians who have written about trying to get past an archivist or a set of archivists to answer troublesome questions. So I'm curious for you two, in terms of the work that you've done and working with the university archivist. Again, my experience at Emory in terms of university archivists, that they were very open to the work. They, and Emory's archive and library in general is a very interactive one. They really prize having public engagement, but that's not the case in every archive. So if the two of you want to add to that.
Yeah, I'm glad that question about archival silences. I am super cognizant of that. And in fact, I am a firm practitioner of Black DH and thinking about shared authority. What is archives? Do you just go through there? And I oftentimes teach Fitzhugh Brundage about the creation of the Alabama State Archives. So my students are where and how do we replicate that? So one of the things that this is where the digital presence come in, and listening to the community and what documents go up and what don't, because from their perspective, they can't go into our special collections. There is no finding aid to even research slavery. The phrase that you will see is slavery might be found here. African Americans might be found here. And then my job has been going, and my partnerships with Kate Matheny and Kevin Waite and others at special collections. Like once I found enslaved people, they go back in and update the little finding aid behind the scenes. And they know what collections I always pull. But how do I make that visible to the community? I listen to them. So for me, and listening to Black women, and especially Black mothers, some of the documents of enslaved women went on my website because they asked for that. I was not comfortable. And I also gave resources for how they process that from slavery scholars. So they just didn't see sexual assault in read without having that context. The other thing I'm listening to them is, as I forge a Mecca-based site, taking the work, they asked not for the records of slavery, but the records of Reconstruction and Jim Crow. So I am prioritizing those records first, because the Black churches who still exist that were founded by formerly enslaved people, the descendant communities who are reaching out to me, That's what they're asking for. And me as the scholar, I have to listen to them too, because I want to make sure that they have a say in what's there. And then I also give to the churches and other material physical copies or digital copies so they also can create their own building. So I really think about shared community ethics and community-based archives and the way that you have your formal archive and then community-based ones that the communities drive. And that I sometimes have to take the backseat to what the community wants. But archival silence is redefining what the archives are in our past histories of this. I'm always conscious and forefront in my mind and having the ethics of care in doing that work.
That's so wonderful. Thank you, Hilary. And you and Kirt are also emphasizing cataloging, which is a critical way that archives create silences. And Kirt is noting in the chat the project led by Sharon Leon and Brenda Gunn. And this is the same one that's funded by the Mellon Foundation, Kirt? Yeah. So the Mellon Foundation is working with them to help libraries and archives rethink how they catalog materials about slavery. And they've asked me and several other scholars to be part of that. So even what words should be used, how far we should go. But I will say that that project is one of, I'm on that project. There's one here at Northwestern where the librarians are recataloging things. And I think there's a third one, I'm not remembering where, but just to say that in library circles, there's a new energy around cataloging and thinking about the terms that are used so that these records are more available and visible. And it's definitely, it seems to be a trend right now. Kirt has also highlighted Cornell's project to create a cross-institutional archive of digital projects. There's so much, as many of you know, digitally that's being created. I actually, Hilary, wanted to ask you, what is the relationship when you take archival materials and put them on your website? How does your archive see that, recognize that?
So that's one of the reasons why they're transcriptions and not images. So I am waiting for them to be, so the faculty minutes just got digitized. So I will include links to those because I can't, I still have to go by their rules about not posting materials. So and so for me, it will be until that stuff is digitized, but the transcriptions are the ones I did that add the location, everything else in there. So you'll start to see the UA watermark on some materials. But until then, people can't read cursive. This is something that my students and I have figured out and community members have figured out. If you digitize material without transcriptions of cursive writing, you just made it visually accessible, but not truly accessible. So this is where those digitizations and going hand in hand with transcriptions, I think will be the pathway forward. But the first thing is to get that stuff available and not just accessible in a building that's only available from 9 to 2 on a day.
I just want to, on this subject of archives, I want to say Kirt is saying that his library team helps him every day tracking down materials. And then we have two, I'm not surprised, two experiences, been with you, Glenn Tall and Nika Sewell-Smith, where the archivist says, oh, those aren't cataloged. Oh, they're all the way in the basement, blah, 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 blah. And this is a typical, this is the historian's persistence. Keep asking. The first time I looked at records at the New York Historical Society, their elevator was broken. Fortunately, the archivist went to wherever it was to get them and came up. She looked a little hot and bothered, but I needed those materials. And but often we do get pushback when people are worried about what our topics are. And I would say, don't tell them what you're working on. Just say, I want to read these things. But anyway, I want to go back to this question because the digitization that Hilary talks about, recataloging, these all take resources. And so the broader question too that was earlier is, are these projects, slavery in the university projects and now slavery and segregation projects, are they more likely to be at Research One and elite institutions? And I'll say that for my article that I wrote for the AAUP, I had an undergraduate looking at exactly that question. Where are the projects? We tried to find them all. And she did come back with the idea that these are mostly at Research One and elite, say, flagship public institutions. And so part of the question that was asked too is it possible that other institutions are doing this, but it's just not as visible? And what does it mean when at a Research One institution, eventually you can make the argument that it's research. But if you're at an institution where research, teaching, and service are also blurred in particular kinds of ways, what is the meaning of that? And I don't know if either of you in your conversations with scholars at other institutions, or maybe people have reached out to you from other institutions trying to start these kinds of projects, and if you have anything to share or advice to share about that.
I will say I started out at the HBCU, a public HBCU, where it was a 4-4, and by the end I was teaching a 6-6. And I did community-based projects there too. It just wasn't on slavery. It was on the civil rights movement. But one of the things that I did was through teaching community-based histories and early WordPress sites that my friend Charles Reed at ECSU has done. It made history alive for our students and made them more employable. So one of the things that we started to do by teaching local history, we were able to get students interested in history in a state that wanted to close down the school and the department for low production. Public history and doing this work actually saved those departments and gave a place for the school that ECSU, where I'm still a part of, are now looking at their history of education from Roosevelt schools and the Black experience, and making sure that the HBCU history of the small Northeast North Carolina schools out there, and it involves students along the way. And so for me, whether or not you're at a teaching school, like a smaller one, or R1s always get the press, right, but the work is being done. And this is one of the things that I appreciate about Leslie and Kirt and others. You find your community, you find your resources. Now for funding agencies, they need to have funding for you. It's not just the R1s. I know there's the HBCU initiatives and others. We need to start maximizing getting funders to make sure that small institutions have equal access to these community-based projects. And I think it's something that we can talk to and across, but we have to recognize funding is the issue, and then the challenge and the needs of smaller teaching institutions versus R1s, especially state-funded R1s versus private funded R1s too.
I'll add also, you're reminding me that the Jesuit schools, higher education, so of course from Georgetown, but I gave a talk at Xavier University in Ohio. There is the beginning of a collaboration among those schools to raise money and to contribute money that they have to address exactly these kinds of issues. Of course, scholarships and diversity and equity, and I want us to circle back to that, how these projects feed into that. But also, I think, to continue the research work and to move beyond the enslavement of African-American people. Those Catholic schools, and probably many of our schools, as Craig Wilder's research tells us, a long tangled history with Native Americans and other groups. And so I do think that this brings me to one of my other questions is, one, what is the relationship between doing this work and the larger institutional equity questions that are part of higher education today? And second, what does it mean, instead of each individual institution doing the work, what does it mean if we begin to think more collaboratively across institutions? What if certain groups of institutions began pooling funds, resources of all kinds, et cetera? So I'd love to hear more from the two of you about that.
Yeah, honestly, I think we need collaboration between groups in a way that will help push that we're not stuck with institutions determining who gets money, who doesn't, which faculty gets money, which doesn't. And the larger issue of equity, especially if you're a faculty of color versus not. I put this to say that I have never got paid any extra for my work. This has all been on top. It's service, but service that is unpaid service. And when you think about exploitation, extraction of labor, and what we're talking about, it's a different type of relationship with the institution. But at the same time, how do we get at the equity there? you find community with people of other words. And this is where I think collaboration, some of my key collaborators are at Michigan State. They're at HBCUs. We fund together. We try to make sure that we put people on. So if someone at the HBCU gets it, I might get a student at Bama, but then the other institutions will be there. We're working a way to cross these lines and find a way for ourselves, but meant by decentering the institution that we are at and not having them driving it, by having equity and inclusion driving it. And in the institution, finding those allies too, that you can collaborate with beyond departmental issues, institutional pressures, and really think about holistically of what I think is Martha Beyonde's book on Black Revolution on Campus. How are these a part of that longer mission since desegregation happened to make the universities and institutions we are more equitable, more inclusive, more diverse? And if we look at that collaboration from outside of our institutions and one another and building a new community will help build a new institution. And these projects can feed into that type of building.
I'm going to just read Kirt. He says he feels he's been shouting into the void about multi-institutional collaboration. We have so many initiatives in development that simply need one university to commit to administering, institutionalizing, and leading the whole affair. It requires a commitment of resources that goes beyond individual faculty commitments and beyond the capacities of shorter-term service projects. And I couldn't agree more. I want to add into that, and this was a question I had long ago about, in Atlanta, all of those institutions, HBCU, the campuses, the collective there, Emory, Georgia State, and not to mention UGA, just a little while away. I had a question a long time ago about how can we share resources in a way that doesn't feel extractive or, charitable in a condescending way. And I'll just say that one of the responses I feel like I got, not quite directly, was, as I asked the question and it was not answered, is frankly the competitive nature of institutions, which, U.S. News and World Report, we really need to do away with that as a metric for anything. I wish that institutions would stop. But that competition and this idea of being competitive for funding, competitive for donors, instead of seeing our higher education networks as an ecosystem that needs we need community colleges, we need non-research one, we need schools that are teaching intensive, we need HBCUs for their models of helping students who need a little bit more to survive college. We need research ones to do research, but we also need HBCUs to train people to be able to come to research ones and do research. Without HBCUs, our number of Black PhDs in all fields would virtually dry up. So if we can move beyond this sort of singular or competitive model to one in which we really see our higher education system as we say all the time, strength and diversity, it seems like we could move to a different space, and certainly this project is one in which where that should happen. I mean, one of the questions I think we get asked about doing this work is the work of repair as well, right? Reparations, repair, whatever. So certainly the monuments and the renaming of individual campuses is important, but the larger work of repair, what do we do with multiple generations that were excluded from higher education because of the practices of these institutions? And that means loss of wealth, loss of opportunity, loss of employment, loss of knowledge. That kind of repair seems only possible on a broad scale across institutions, not by individual institutions repairing, right? So for example, when Georgetown said, we will do this for that group who we harmed. Well, but that harm was not only for that group, it was for everyone to some degree. So it pushes back against the kind of individualism in American history, but it really seems to be what's necessary. And I'm with Kirt, how do we, as people doing this work of universities in slavery, studying slavery, how do we model that? And what does it mean if Is it one institution that takes it on? Is it multiple institutions? Even what is the human resource that is necessary to build across institutions? And this is where I'm really annoyed that his microphone isn't working, because I'm sure he has lots of ideas about this. So type away, Kirt, and I will read whatever you write. And Hilary, if you have any thoughts about this.
This is one of the things that I had to learn in my journey, and I had to tell people. It is not my individual responsibility to fix the University of Alabama. It is not one institution's responsibility to fix this long institutional history of slavery and institutional, and then also how institutions of slavery became defenders of segregation and segregationists. So that long through line of race, and now we're just in a diverse, equity, and inclusion world. And we have to do this. I think this is a role for not just that, but the role of our professional organizations too, to set those models and standards. Because what I oftentimes get from other faculty, others, well, you're a historian. I don't have a part of that. I don't need to talk about that. And I'm like, well, when you look at who the alumni are of your institutions, who are the presidents of our own organizations, how this comes in, and I had to give a plug because I missed it yesterday. UA renamed the building that was named after Albert Burton Moore. He served as the SHA president in 1942. He was the president of the Alabama Historical Association for their chair of the history department. He led the centennial celebration of the Lost Cause Civil War celebration in Alabama. They just rededicated a building after the first African-American tenure track faculty member yesterday. So faculty replaced faculty. When that name got renamed, I heard from people, well, what did he do? He wasn't this. I'm like, he was faculty. He was a scholar. He was an organizational president that shaped our field. And if we have our professional organizations behind this work, we might be able to ease the funding part and build a collaborative model and build what we have, because it's not just our responsibility. It's our individual responsibility to fix the institution. But I always tell my student, I'm not replicating the harm that was done to me going through this trajectory too. And if we think about what is our mission at these places and where we feel in these conversations, we have to push for new models. We have to be innovative. And that means we also have to start collaborating, which historians, we don't do too well. But we need to get out of our comfort zones. And if I can get out of my comfort zone to talk about slavery, to research the names of enslaved people, to look at building, working with my colleagues in music and recreating a speech that Booker T. Washington did. So I had friends who are opera singers actually performing the original church, the songs that were performed at that event, because I can't sing. But we made this an event that we performed it at the church, and the minister and the current descendants were in tears because it promoted that part of their history, not Bloody Tuesday, not slavery, but how they empowered her in there. This is what we mean multidimensional, interdisciplinary. Can we use Minecraft to recreate the campuses and reinsert people into that landscape that are absent? We need a push to ourselves, but this is collaboration's key. It's not just one institution. It's all of us.
That's great. I'll say too that it takes time. So when I did the work at Emory, we started, history, journalism, but over time, as people learned about the work, the theater department did a play. Other people joined in from their disciplines. I'll never forget the PE teacher on the original campus in Oxford who created a running path that went past historical sites. So students had to take note of that. I mean, people found their way to us because it wasn't a single year, but it was a multi-year project, and one that we said was open to anyone who had curiosity, and you could figure out how your discipline can address it. And that kind of patience sometimes is, again, it's not about a competition of finishing, but it's about how do we draw people in so that they can find their way and have the creative space to develop something. It's really important. Just checking the chat. Kirt is saying that the memorial and other projects that visibly demonstrate that the university includes a diverse set of people who work there do a lot to make the school feel a lot more inclusive, and they get emails and photos from students and alums all the time who are connecting and reconnecting to the school. That these projects can be a way of welcoming back people who often have felt left out, unimportant, disengaged from the institution. Rose Stremlau at Davidson. Hilary visited there as the Van Professor of Ethics. Yay. They have support from the college president, but it permeates the college in that many departments, not just history and African American studies, I'm assuming, are taking on components of this work. Students touch it. And I think for me, often the most moving parts of many of these projects are the incorporation of students who begin to see research in a very alive way, in a way that, in many of these projects, the research is done by students and they see themselves as contributing to the institution in a way that's really important. Let's see. Nika Sewell-Smith, remembering that harm is multidimensional and atonement must be as well. Yeah, so let me see if anything else on my questions. Hilary, you touched on what this work means for historians and historical organizations, including the Southern Historical Association, the AHA, the OAH, American Studies. How could these organizations provide support? I mean, these are membership organizations. I think all of the organizations, I think, are wondering, particularly in the COVID era, what are we doing besides just conferences, given that we're not gathering as we used to for conferences. We're doing sessions online, but that's not the same. And I think a lot of institutions are thinking, what is going to be the purpose? And how should our professional organizations think about this work? How can they support this work? And what might that mean for a different role for professional organizations, I guess?
So this is where, because I forget Kirt is still muted, but that's okay. I know he's typed a lot. So I think this is two ways here. One, this is a growing subfield in our profession. I am grateful for everyone who has written about this work and published what their institutions are doing, because without that, I could not have taught. I'm teaching a grad level seminar next year, just reading all the latest anthologies and work that has come out, because it's coming out furiously, fast and furiously, and the types of histories that center Black people and the complexities of this history. So I think we as a profession, we need to recognize this as scholarship and provide spaces for it at our conferences, for the research, not just how we do it in teaching wise, but methods wise, digital humanities wise, thinking about a Daacke cap on campus histories. So you want to revise your campus history, this is here, type of thing. So practicums that way, but make spaces in our journals for special issues, other types of publications. But I think the other one is we are doing the work on our campuses. We will be remiss if we don't do our institutional reckoning too. Because if we don't recognize our institutions as organizations, we're part of the problem of slavery, segregation, and the stuff that we're combating on our campuses. We won't be able to get more work done in terms of systematic changes, in terms of, can we have a pipeline for African-American scholars into the field and PhDs? Can we bring HBCUs firmly into our organizations in terms of scholarship, in terms of membership, in terms of attendance? Our park rangers who can't come to our thing, how can we make hybrids so people at the national parks who are doing the work on the ground can come in here? And I think that has to go back to what is our profession has been done in our organizational frame. So if we go that way, we need to really take the work that we're doing on our campus and make it larger. And then we can use our organizations as lobby groups for legislation that's coming our way. I'm sorry, I'm in a state that I'm expecting the anti-CRT coming any day right now and attacking our department because of the way it's been framed. It's nice to have the AHA, OAH advocate, but also free up money, travel grants. They can have that in there as well. And I think that's one thing, but has to recognize that's not individual campus, it's our whole profession first. Reckon with that, and then we can reckon on the other issues of diversity, equity, inclusion from slavery to the present.
I want to note that at least 3 people are noting that at their institutions there has been some renaming, but beyond that, the institutions are not joining universities studying slavery. They don't want to go any further than, setting up a new name somewhere, I'll just say. This one of my questions was roadblocks to forward motion from the two of you. And I think we can expand this to what happens when you hit a roadblock in the work, if you're beginning the work, or even if you're in the middle of the work. I mean, I'll just say UVA deciding to move to study segregation down to 1965, I was super impressed because you're bringing that into living history. People who are still alive. I mean, if you went to 1985, you'd really be hitting something. And it might happen. I'm not saying it won't happen, but the closer we come to the present, the more this is, gonna could make some people very uncomfortable. So I guess I'd love to hear people talk. And I'm seeing also the anti-CRT, the thinking about critical, quote unquote, critical race theory, which I think is pretty clear. It's really anti-discussing white supremacy, discussing slavery, discussing racism, etc. So any thoughts about that? And the chat is also very active about our students being allies in this work.
Yeah, one of the things I think about all the time is institutional values don't always share my values in terms of what this work does, as well as pace of work. So the biggest roadblock and concern is how to sustain this if the institutional will is only we put up a marker. And I say that because I had a faculty member tell me that to my face in front of the provost trying to dismantle my work. And I had to respond, who are the we and who are the they, as the only Black person in that audience being asked this question. So it became, now I'm here because we removed monuments, we removed building names. We had the reverse after we put up the apology marker in 2006. We removed the building name. You should be happy. And I'm like, why are we happy? So it's really pushed against that type of roadblock. And then the other real roadblock, honestly, is burnout. How do you keep active? How do you not say? And anyone who follows me on Twitter knows I have thoroughly embraced self-care. I take days off. I have to recharge myself to do this work because if not, my institution doesn't matter. It will not care about my health. I need to be more centered about my health. And so how do we go beyond performance? So my biggest roadblock now is performativity of narratives, tokenization, and being out there as the person. I'm like, I just want to be in the crowd doing the work. But how do you push against those roadblocks? Because it means more time on my own work, less time to write, and more stress. So self-care became my mantra and disinterest across the way. But at the same time, students and involving students in this process, because my students are also looking at this and seeing their place and they want to leave. And I want them to stay and graduate to make them get on the alumni side. So we're working this out together. And that's one of the reasons why I think the autoethnographic approach and being upfront with my roadblocks, upfront with the process, upfront that I do this helps build another type of community of those who want to but feel left out. And then also to really think about that. But roadblock is institutional will, tendencies to whitewash narratives, tendencies to tokenize the few people who are out there doing the work, who will take all the institutional hits from donors, random emails, and the like. That leads to burnout. So recognize yourself and your care in doing this work.
So I'm been keeping an eye on the chat. A couple of things. A lot of people saying polite disinterest to non-polite disinterest, and I would just agree that that is definitely part of the challenge of this work at times. Again, students as allies, and then continuing the why moving into segregation. The segregation era, a couple of people talking about the different issues that come up when you begin to deal with that time period. I know at Alabama, right, there was initially am I thinking of the right monument that was honoring those who struggled against segregation at the university? But when did that monument go up?
That's 2000s. So,
Right.
so the Hood Malone Plaza, I want to say that's 2010. That comes up. Two buildings renamed after civil rights pioneers, and then marker actually to honoring Lucy Foster, who received a PhD, honorary doctorate a couple of years ago. But it's all civil rights stuff. And then in 2006, we have the One to Slavery and the Apology.
Mm-hmm.
So that's about it. But it's the pushing towards the happy progress narrative, the happy narrative of, hey, we're no longer all white anymore. We're no longer finally impressing people. But that has also masked a whole bunch of things. I think I'd rather have truthful narratives rather than narratives that are simplified, glory, Disney-fied narratives, as I like to say, that we get. And I think that's a challenge that we have to go for the good stories. And I agree with Kirt. The good stories, what people want. They don't want the bad stories.
Right. And several people have sort of asked this question, and Kirt is also picking this up. Like, what do you do? I mean, our institutions are rooted in white supremacist histories, academia, our disciplines, etc. How do we, and then I think that's directly linked, frankly, to the institutional desire to tell the good stories, because that upholds this idea. And so how do we, continue to push back against that remains the question. There are several people who are agreeing that is a central part of the struggle.
And I think one of the best advices that I got came from was a Fuentes. And you need to tell your own story. Don't let the institution tell it. And document what you did and publish those. And I think when we think about publications, some of my short publications have been reflection pieces. Mm-hmm. That has been a way to make sure that I'm telling the story that I want rather than what UA wants to tell of me. And so, because I recognize that tension, but I think because I do history of education and memory, I'm also conscious aware of all of this. So we always need to tell our stories first and how to really push against the feel good, but also to the uncomfortableness for me personally. I am not a person who wants to be led. I just want to be like, I'm just going to do my work or engage in the community. I had to get comfortable finding myself on student newspaper pictures and everything else in media because that's not me. And but at the same time, without that, I couldn't do a certain other thing. So I learned more about myself and more about other people, which is why building that community and decentering the school outside of that community, outside the institution, has been foundational. Why I've been able to do this work since 2015. Because if otherwise, it would not have looked the same because I would not recognize myself in the process.
Any other questions? Let me look back at my list of questions and see if we've I didn't ask this question. What do you think are the most meaningful achievements you have witnessed or facilitated at your institution? What do you think is your most so far? I'm going to say so far because the work continues, but what did you feel, that really?
The first, two, and they were recent. I had a descendant. So one of the things I've done is try to locate descendants. And when I located Jeremiah Barnes as a descendant and started to talk about him, having his current living descendant who's in Ohio, she's a former school teacher in her 60s, reach out to me through email based on the few documents that I had on my website. And striking up a conversation with her. And I went on Zoom during the COVID realities to talk about that. I left that conversation and I was in tears because I made impact beyond the scholarly. And then the other was seeing the boulder removed. First, the plaque removed on June 8th, 2020. And then the next day, seeing it on a flatbed put into storage. And by the time I came back out in the afternoon, sod was down. You couldn't even see where it was. And to walk by that knowing what has been removed and have to point out the empty pedestal. Well, we just have an empty plot of grass that I can point at the students like, yes, that used to be a monument that caused a lot of pain. What happens when students speak up and the administration actually listens because of the political moment rather than ignores them? That I can point to. But having that descendant, Jeremiah Barnes, reach out to me has been one of the proudest moments that I've ever experienced doing this work.
Thank you for sharing. Kirt, do you want to give me a chance?
Please type it.
Yeah. We had a similar moment of descendants coming back to the institution at Emory. For Kirt, it's been two things: creating the space for the university to begin to engage with descendants, and then a summer camp, bringing in high school students for a week at UVA, working with UVA students, visiting historic sites, archives, doing archaeology, engaging the community, asking questions. It's always a profound experience for all of us every year. So I like this pairing because one is a sort of these almost singular moments, the removal of something, but then also the ongoing work of engaging with communities, with descendants, and making these places more welcome, in a sense, and active sites of repair, that when those students come in, they're participating in remaking the institution into something different, an institution that has different goals, different audiences than it did in the past. Great. I'm going to invite the audience to submit more questions. Let's see. Oh, yeah. This is a great question. Yes, there's been a great deal of energy lately since the publication of the landmark study landgrabu.org on reckoning with the legacies of land grab universities, specifically in relationship to Indigenous peoples. Some of us doing the work are drawing a lot on the work of the scholars here. To what degree do you see engagement with these emergent efforts as related to or divergent from those discussed here? And then I'll ask the next question as well.
Yeah, no, that's one of my hopes, especially as I try to loop in the appropriate side because University of Alabama's on indigenous land. They stay open by selling indigenous land to the West. They're part of Land Grab U, and also to our own history of indigenous students on campus and that longer history. And I expanded out to our Asian American students. If we can talk about the African American experience in slavery, how can we also talk about the other racialized groups on our campus who are also hidden, include also to LGBTQ plus groups as well? How could that be the window to talk about the entire institution? And my hope is that we have collaborations across the boards between institutions on the same topic, because it's all about memory and erasure. And like to see our institutions as not doing what they have done as bad actors. And I saw something about urban renewal too, like when we talk about those things of displacement. And our institutions are not always the ones we want to praise, and they didn't do always praiseworthy things. So I think we can really, we need all of it. And my year at Davidson, one of the things that one of my colleagues did there, Sarah Wahid, because I know Rose is on the line, she started talking about some of the students from India and that India, Southeast Asia, and especially after some of the attacks during COVID and involving students. And we were able to have similar conversations about the archives. How do we get at these voices? How do we get here? But how can we use one another to research, but also amplify even these stories? So I see it as another avenue for more collaboration, but to very much tell the full stories of our institutions, not just the African-American experience.
I'll say, of course, I'm at Northwestern, which also, along with the University of Denver, these were separate investigations into the history of John Evans and Native American genocidal actions, frankly, It's very interesting to read both of those studies, which I've taught them together, to see how Northwestern versus the University of Denver, which is closer to the site of the crime, if you will, happened, and how they chose to interpret what their mission is moving forward. I think that the ongoing investigation into Native histories is directly aligned, not at all divergent from what we're talking about here. One other question, well, I want to just note that Kirt says that the high school students, after a week of looking at the difficult history at the institution, suddenly want to come to UVA, are not driven away. And I'll say that when I began to do the work, there was a lot of fear on the part of development, on the not everyone, but and I think administrators, a kind of generalized fear of, will this drive people away? And I have always said that the vast majority of response is appreciation that the university is doing something difficult, because we are often people who have done the difficult work alone without the institution acknowledging that the work existed to be done. And so when an institution says, yes, this is work and it's difficult, and even though it's difficult, we're going to do it, that really makes you feel a whole lot different about doing the work. I do want, this is a great question by Rose Stremlau. How do folks respond when descendants don't agree on how, or even if they want the institution to discuss their ancestors' stories? And I'll say, as we move into the 20th century, with people who experience these institutions during the era of desegregation and who had horrible experiences, what if you want to honor their struggle, but they don't want any part of your institution because of what they went through? There are gaps in terms of alumni engagement because people had horrible experiences as non-majority members of the institution. And I'll mention just one thing that happened at Emory, which was an attempt to repair that in the 50s, there was the dental school controversy in which Jewish students at the dental school were graded as failing, even though they had not failed, and were driven out of the dental school. And a graduate, most of them went on to excel greatly in other schools and in their discipline. But a graduate, not a graduate of Emory, but one of the students from that time gathered those oral histories and made a documentary with the help of someone in Jewish studies, and then brought those people back to Emory to commemorate that moment. But that could have gone any number of ways. People don't want to re-engage with the place that harmed them unless they're sure that it's a genuine re-engagement. So I wonder if any of you have experience, either of you have experience with that, and how have you handled that? Or are you even in a process of engagement on an issue, a set of issues around that?
I am aware of this, and I think it goes back to a larger practice about shared authority, shared communication, and working with descendants. If they say no, it won't be no. I won't put it up anywhere. But I will encourage them to possibly do what I look to how segregationists deal with this question. They just lock their materials down. They're like, if you have a time, you could be in the driving seat, get your materials, oral histories done, so future where you and the community decide to let this be accessible, you can. Or you could be the ones to determine who can print your stuff and who can't. So I educate that, but I respect their decision not to have the institution use their story after replicating harm, especially if they haven't had the trust and rebuilt the trust that is involved, and it's not going to an extractive model, but actually a collaborative model. And I let the descendants decide that. So for me, the historical documents there, but if they don't want to go further, don't want an identification of modern day links to them, we have to respect that.
Great. And I'll read out Kirt's response too. It's been a wake-up call for the university to learn that we don't get to tell these stories without their consent, because frankly, a lot of the stories got told without consent and of course mishandled in the past, but that's not true anymore. Here at UVA, That relationship now includes asking for their input and feedback on anything that we are creating that depicts their ancestors in any way. I'm going to say yes, that is the way to go. And then Kirt also says some descendants have created their own nonprofit organization. They are part of the group the university now consults with and engages with and consults. DescendantsUVA.org is the organization. And finally, Kirt says we have a descendant outreach researcher who works with descendants with them in full ownership of the genealogies and histories. And of course, we know that the genealogical moment is in full swing right now, and people are doing their own family histories. So thinking about how to collaborate with them as equal researchers, not as people to be extracted from, I think is important and critical.
And I think that's one of my forthcoming articles. I'm doing a collaborative with Christy Hyman at the University of Nebraska at Lincoln, as well as Nashani Fraser at Kansas University. What is the ethics of doing collaborative community-based digital Black DH? What kind of questions we have, and the descendants are front center of that.
Right.
And how can we bring those ethics and methodologies to institutions and also convince the institution, like, they said no, you don't have their consent. You can't, you're going to have to deal with that and move forward.
Good. So it's I have 7 minutes after 2 my time. So we have about 8 more minutes. Are there other questions that people have that they want to drop into the chat? Or anything from from Hilary and Kirt that I haven't discussed or asked that you wanted to emphasize as well?
I just have one thing for those in the audience who are doing this work. Thank you. No one says thank you enough. We need to say thank you to one another and to remind to take care of ourselves and build community and to disengage the university sometimes. But I value your service and your work, because without you, I wouldn't persist. And we need to say that to one another more often, and don't let the naysayers or polite disinterest get you discouraged. But we need all of you to do this, because the more of us doing it, the institutions start to realize. And once they see there's money behind it, they really will start taking interest. So we have to use one another for there. But thank you for all that you do as well.
Thanks, Hilary. That's a wonderful sentiment. I also want to say on the self-care piece, for me, part of self-care in doing the work that I did at Emory was trying to engage and build other leaders, so that if I needed to step away, which I knew that I would want and need to do, that I felt like the work could be carried on by someone else. And more than one person, just identifying collaborators and people who, for them, this would be an opportunity in a different way than, as we talked about at the beginning, it just happened to land in our laps. And I do think that as we've continued, that there are more people who actively are interested in this kind of work. They see it connected to DEI work or not, as research work, and who want to do this work. So to the degree that we can build leadership allies, so Hilary, I kind of want to ask you, is there anyone else who's going to be doing that tour?
Yes, there is. I do have student groups doing it. I was, thank goodness, on sabbatical last year, so it forced other people doing it. So I don't walk the campus as much anymore.
Great. Someone asked if this panel is being recorded. It is being recorded. I don't remember what the disposition of the recording is. I think we all agreed to have it distributed. But I can't say enough how much, I think one of our earliest questions on the chat was about disappearance and silences in the archives. And sometimes there is a gap that leads to a silencing. And I guess for me, I'm always thinking about how will the work carry on, that not seeing myself or any of us as the only repository of how to do this work, but really it is about sharing it so that it can continue intergenerationally, across campuses, et cetera, et cetera. Kirt says, I raised an important point. So much of this work only lives as long as those who are committed to do it. And institutions, yes, are often content to let the moment pass when the dedicated stop or leave. And this has been true over and over again. We, those of us in African American studies programs and departments know that the history of those programs and departments is often one person for 30 years as the chair or director. And then you know, that's just not, that's not institutionally sustainable, not for that person and not for the institution. And I mean institution, not just the university, but these projects of disciplinary projects of this kind of work. So I encourage you all to really think about that as part of your self-care. And your care, you know, it's a terrible feeling when something that you've nurtured disappears because there isn't appropriate follow through. So speaking a little bit from experience, sadly. Let's see, 211, anything else? We have a lot of thank yous. We appreciate that you came to be with us today, even with our technical difficulties. In yet another new digital space. I don't know what this particular app is, but here we are. I was very happy to speak you. I'm not going to say speak for you, but to communicate your always incisive points. To all of us. Yes, Kirt did a great job participating, even with a lack of a microphone. Thank you, Kirt. And thanks, Hilary. And oh, hey, Ellen Spears. Hi.
I'm like seeing all these people. I'll see like when I get back next week.
Right. So, well, thanks everyone for attending and for your patience. Hi, Jennifer Ritterhouse. And I think we'll sign off now. Have a great rest of the Southern Historical, and hope to see you in person sometime, somewhere. All right. Take care, everyone. Bye.